Right, Jeremiah 9, let's call this one He Knows, in contrast to chapter 8, where God seemed to emphasize the fact that the people not knowing him led to a whole host of problems. This time in this chapter, where he's going to notice that there's a tendency for the people to become proud or to have become proud. He's going to say that if anyone is going to boast, let him boast in the fact that he actually knows me. Understanding that the beginning of the chapter is going to emphasize the way in which God really seems to want to get away from his people. Verses 1 and 2 specifically saying, "Oh, that I had in the desert a traveler's lodging place, that I might leave my people and go away from them." Understanding that in the following verse 3, he is going to emphasize that that might have a lot to do with the fact that they have been given over to lying in the way that we have seen in most of the chapters leading up to chapter 9. That, however, in this chapter is going to be compounded by the way in which they have flat out become ignorant. Twice in verse 6 and verse 3, lamenting, as we've seen before, the way in which his people seem to no longer know me, as he is going to say. Verse 7, compounding that even further by their backbiting, something he is going to describe more specifically actually in verse 8, talking about the way in which they are treacherous, setting ambushes for one another. All of that seeming to feed in verse 9, a collective delusion that once again, God won't do a thing about it. Verses 10 and 11 going on to say to the contrary, he is actually going to mourn for what he is about to do to them in verse 11, where it says, "I will make Jerusalem a heap of ruins." Once again, in that same theme we've seen before, he's about to make it a desolation. Verses 12 through 16 describing it this way. Once again, answering the question, why? Because they have forsaken, they have not obeyed or walked in his ways, stubbornly following their own hearts. Once again, that same old tradition of doing whatever they wanted without regard to the way it might have hurt or impacted the people around them. Verse 15, therefore saying he will feed them with bitter food, poisonous water, scattering them among the nations until he has consumed them. It's going to say in this verse, or verse 16. Verses 17 on through about, 22 maybe, talking about the way in which he is calling in the professional mourners. That's my paraphrase. Understanding there are cultures where there are people who are paid to professionally mourn. He's saying, bring them on in because they're going to be needed. Moreover, he's saying they should, in verse 20, teach their daughters a lament. In verse 21, saying, why? For death has come into our windows and has entered our places. Verse 22, saying, speak, thus declares the Lord. As we saw in the previous chapter, the bodies, the dead bodies, are going to be stacked up like, or strewn out like dung, leading to the probably the most famous verses in the chapter, verses 23 and 24, that I'm just going to flat out read. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts, boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For these things, or in these things, I delight, declares the Lord. The chapter concluding in verses 25 and 26, talking about the coming days in which he will punish the pretentious, or as it specifically says, those who are circumcised merely in flesh. Once again, seeming to refer back to the way in which they had begun to do whatever they want, regardless of the way it affected the people around them. Understanding that verse 26 seems to make it clear that he is not simply promising to punish the pretentious, but as we've seen in previous chapters, it seems that he is promising to punish all those who have become fixated on their way. Two of the things that most caught my attention in this chapter, probably coming from the first 9 verses, or at least the first of which came from the first 9 verses, where we saw God becoming so exhausted with his people that he just flat out wanted to leave. His people then confusing the grace to change with the permission to continue, leading to the other observation that caught my attention closer to the end of the chapter. That being, this was not their territory. Of course, it had become their inheritance, but that was only because he gifted his land, all of this being his land. He gifted that portion of it, the land of Israel, to his people, understanding that he had already evicted the previous residents, the Canaanites, to make room for the Israelites, something we talked about when we went through the history of the nation. But understand how that relates to us as Christians, those he has described as adopted sons, welcomed to stay insofar as we are taking the grace to change as an opportunity to genuinely grow up into maturity. Otherwise, much like Israel, as we have already mentioned, we can wear out our welcome too.